Bonjour tout le monde, this is John from the Operations family. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you'd like to join our community, feel free to visit our website operations.family and apply. We'd love to have you on board. The interview was organized by Palette, a new sales platform that simplifies and automates sales commissions. If calculating sales commissions is taking too much of your time, or if you'd like to better explain to the sales team how commissions are calculated with real-time dashboards, Palette is directly synchronized with your CRM and other data sources to crunch the numbers and calculate commission payouts. Visit palettehq.com for more information. And now, without further ado, let's hear Sarah Dean, VP of Product Marketing at Unbabel, explain to us how to build an effective messaging strategy. Hello, Sarah.
How's it going?
Good, and you?
I'm great.
Where are you now?
Right now, I am in Mexico. So I'm based in San Francisco, but I've been here for the last 5 months, and I'm on the east coast of Mexico, so the Caribbean side in Playa del Carmen.
Nice one. Okay, nice decision.
Yes.
Cool. So Sarah, actually, we met a couple of weeks ago. I followed you on an intervention you did for a VC fund, and I was really blown away by the presentation you gave. So I kindly ask you if you could do the same for our community, and thank you so much for doing that and sharing your knowledge. You have quite an impressive career, especially that you worked your way up from marketing associate to marketing manager to marketing director, and now VP at super cool companies like SurveyMonkey and now Unbabel. Unbabel that I've been following. I met your CEO a couple of years ago. They had just finished YC, and we were invited at a party organized by a VC fund. And everyone was gluing your CEO, and he was like the superstar of the event. So we are going to change the format a little bit. Usually we do a one-on-one conversation and interview, but I loved the presentation you gave, and I thought that we could do a master class this time.
Yeah.
And the master class would be about messaging and branding, and so I'll leave the mic to you. So thanks again for doing that, and I'm sure that everyone will love this content.
I hope so, and I'm excited to be here and talk about it. Messaging is something I love to do, and it's at the heart of everything I think about. So I'm always happy to share what I've learned with people. So let me just kind of get started by sharing my screen, and then we'll kick it off. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. Excuse me. So as you mentioned, we are going to be going over sort of a workshop of how to build an effective messaging strategy. And I'll break it down into very tactical processes and then give you examples as well. But before I get started, a little bit about Unbabel, where I currently am, because I'm going to use Unbabel as an example of how we applied this framework at Unbabel. So Unbabel, as you mentioned, is a startup. It's a Series C startup. We were founded in 2013. So we've been around for 8 years. We're at about 200 people based in Lisbon and San Francisco, which is where I'm typically based when I'm not in Mexico. And our mission really in the world is to break language barriers and create universal understanding. And we're building a language operations platform that allows people across an organization to interact with customers in any language. And part of that work is creating this whole new category around language operations. We won't go into category creation today because I could do a whole another session on that, and it's its own discipline. But messaging is a critical part of any company, but also especially when you're creating a new category. So I will use that as an example throughout this deck to kind of show you examples of how we've done it. So before we get started, I love this quote by Ben Horowitz, which really talks about the fact that the company story is the company strategy. And I think that's so important to really realize that they are they can't live without each other. You can't have a strategy for the company without the company story, right? And I think a lot of companies do realize that, and a lot of leadership teams recognize the importance of messaging and having a company story. But what I have seen is that not a lot of companies put the right amount of effort into getting it right in the beginning, because it's always something that you think should be just done very quickly, because you're always running at 100 speed. But really, it's important to take your time and do it well in the beginning, especially for early stage startups, because that will set the foundation for almost everything you do. To get it right in the beginning is so critical. And I don't see a lot of early stage startups put a lot of effort into it. So I think it's really important to do that at the beginning and not wait. Um, the other thing that I think is really important for people to understand is the distinction between positioning and messaging. Excuse me. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably, especially when they talk about product marketing. They just think positioning and messaging is the same thing. And while, again, this is one of those things where you can't have one without the other, but they are two very distinct disciplines. So positioning really is about owning your market position, like what is unique about you and how do you want it to be perceived, right? That's positioning. Messaging is really the words that you use to communicate that to different audiences. And you can't have good messaging if you don't have good positioning. So it's important to have your positioning nailed down first. Who are you? And then build your messaging. For today's process, I'm going to focus a lot more on messaging and how to communicate that vision. But we will talk about positioning because, like I said, you can't really have one without the other. Um, One of the things that I often get asked is what is the most difficult thing when it comes to building messaging? And to be honest, at the end of the day, messaging is really sitting down and writing a story, right? So the biggest challenge really, when what I've seen is when it comes to doing it for a company where you almost always build your own language internally. Every company has its internal lingo. You tend to talk about things in your product and services in a way where it most probably makes sense to you internally because you get used to using that same language and you know the product so well, but it might not translate to the outside world. And people often get hung up on how they think about the company and how much they know. So in some cases, too much knowledge is almost an inhibitor to building messaging sometimes, because you get hung up on features and functionality, especially at very like typical SaaS startups, right? Like you just get hung up on features and functionality. So it's so important to step outside of your echo chamber and make space for outside perspective, because at the end of the day, you're not marketing to people that really know your technology in depth. And maybe in some ways they will never know and never want to know, right? They just want to know what your benefit is to them and how it makes their life easier. So the biggest challenge for people often is to make space for that outside perspective. And so the whole process is really designed to bring that perspective into your messaging. And before we jump into the process, the other thing that I would love to go over is really what is effective messaging. We're talking about building effective messaging, but what does that look like? In my mind, there's really three key things that you need to have to build effective messaging. One, relevancy, and this seems obvious, but it's important to think about. Relevancy to your audience is the most obvious one that most people talk about. But it's not just relevancy to your audience, it's also relevancy in terms of the time, the channel, the format that the messaging is delivered in. What you deliver over social media is not going to be the same as what you use in a sales pitch, for instance, right? So you really have to think about the flexibility of your message and make sure that it's relevant for different channels and different formats. Authenticity is also really, really important. And I don't think anyone sort of approaches messaging in a way where like we want it to be inauthentic, right? Everyone wants to be authentic. But what does that mean? I think we all kind of get hung up on, especially in marketers, we get hung up on trying to make things sound sophisticated sometimes because it makes us feel like it plays up the product or service more, right? But at the end of the day, you actually want to do the opposite. You want to use the simplest language you can and sound more human. Use as less jargon as possible because you want to really get your message across and come across as human. At the end of the day, even if you're selling to B2B, there's still a human at the end. So you want your messaging to be authentic. And lastly, credibility. a lot of companies, and I've seen this a lot, tend to use this sort of template of we're the world's biggest, largest, greatest XYZ platform, right? And you might as well be, and you maybe are, right? But you can't make claims like that until you're backing that up with some kind of a data or a proof point, right? So don't just say we're the world's leading XYZ platform unless you can really prove it. So add some credibility to your message, because people are so overwhelmed and inundated in today's world with all of the same kind of messages that it becomes noise. And so, and to really stand out, you need to make sure that you're using some proof to give
Right.
yourself
It actually
credibility.
kills the authenticity. Like sometimes it's
Mhm.
actually good to acknowledge one's weaknesses,
Exactly.
and
There are
it's actually
gaps,
make you
mention them.
more authentic and relevant to the audience.
Exactly. I think people resonate with that a lot more. All right. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to go over sort of the 7-step process that I've built over the years, that I've applied at different companies, and it seems to work really well. But I'll do that in the context of Unbabel. So, I started at Unbabel about 8 months ago. Obviously, the company has been around for 8 years, and as a startup, you kind of evolve over time, and Unbabel has evolved over time. The product has matured, we've built new features, the vision has always stayed the same, but obviously the product is maturing. And over the course of the time, our messaging, we've played around with different messaging in the history of the company. So even if you go onto Google, for example, and Google and Babel, you'll kind of see different messages that show up. And so we're at that stage where consistency is really important. And last year when I started, we launched a new product, are really like part of our platform that allowed us to really reposition our product entirely as more of a platform. And so that was a great opportunity for us to really kind of redo our messaging framework. So the process that we went through is what I'm going to talk to you about. But really what we started out to do was that, one, like I said, we wanted to create consistency in how we talk about it in Babel, both internally and externally. And it's important to acknowledge the internal piece of it as well, because people internally at your company are sort of an extension of the company. And so it's important to arm them with the same sort of consistent message so that they are also spreading your message. It's not just marketing that talks about the product, right? It's the sales team, it's the product team. Everyone should be doing that. And then the next thing we really wanted to achieve was to really clearly articulate our value to our customers and echo how they talk. And we sell to customer service today. Our vision is obviously to sell horizontally into a company across functions, but today we start with customer service. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were articulating our value to the customer service world and using the language that they use so that it resonates with them. Again, the going back to authenticity, I always mess that word up. We wanted to be human. We wanted to use simple language and avoid unnecessary jargon. It's also important at startups, especially, I think this can be a struggle, right? Like you have this grand vision of where you want to go, but then obviously the reality is different, right? Because you're still working your way towards that vision. So for us, it's similar. Like our vision is to build the language operations platform. And today we're working on a very specific functional use case of customer service. So we had to really strike a balance between where we are today and where we're going. And then for us specifically, we also are creating this new category. So we wanted to introduce this new category to the world and make sure that everything we do moving forward ties back to that idea. So that, again, going back to consistency, everything should be consistent. And so the process that we used is sort of the 7-step process. And I'll go through each of these in more detail, but it's developing the framework, doing the research, you go into the draft mode, then you test and refine, gather your proof points, and then it's rolling out and measuring impact. And the ones that are sort of highlighted at the end are where we are today at Unbabel. So I will have fewer examples there than I do for the rest of the process, but I'll certainly walk you through what the rollout looks like and how you can measure impact. So let's dive in. The first step is really stepping back and thinking about what your messaging framework looks like. This will be different for every company, right? There's no one template or formula that works for everyone. and it should be different. But the way to think about it is that there's going to be layers of your messaging. One layer that will be consistent for everyone is your brand messaging, because everyone has a brand. This is your corporate messaging, how you talk about your company at a high level. And then the next few layers will really depend on your go-to-market strategy, right? Whether you're selling to different personas, you will likely need messaging there. Or do you have different use cases of your product? Do you have different regions that you sell to and different verticals and so forth, right? So you really need to customize this and figure out what are the layers that you actually need before you start planning. For Unbabel,
This is super important because I know that some products are more horizontal than others. And for the product marketing team, it can be very hard when the product is horizontal to
yes.
produce content and to produce messaging because there are so many use cases that you need to address. Whereas a more vertical company, it will be way easier to catch up and produce
Yeah.
very targeted. So it's really related to also the sales motion and how horizontal is the product.
Exactly. And your segmentation as well. So I was actually reading this morning somewhere about Airtable, which is one of the products I love to use. And it's the same dilemma from a product marketing perspective. Airtable is such a flexible product that
Mm-hmm.
you could use it for almost anything. So from a positioning perspective, who do you talk to, right? And so it's really that strategy of segmenting your product. Oftentimes people will package it for the top use cases and then have a more generic messaging
Yeah.
for everyone else. And we kind of had that issue at SurveyMonkey also, because we had some very distinct audiences, but then at the end of the day, people could be using it for like personal use cases, like a birthday survey,
Mhm.
or like a more really robust enterprise survey. So
Yeah.
it's like a spectrum of things. So exactly, it is so important to nail that down. And you might not always capture everything, but at least when you start this process out, you want to be thoughtful about what are the top ones that you want to tackle, and
Yeah.
do it in phases. You also don't have to try to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
And so going back to what we did at Unbabel, and again, this is the start of our journey as well, right? So we broke it down into sort of three layers that we tackled. The first one being the brand messaging, which I mentioned is something everyone should have. This is the most aspirational, transformative version of your messaging, which includes things like your purpose, your vision, mission, and so forth, your taglines, all of that. The next layer is really your audience, and that's the most motivational layer of your messaging. So this would be your buyer types. For us, for instance, we have customer service as an audience, but it could also be other audiences. You're selling to your buyers, but at the same time, there might be other people. Like we have channel partners. So that for us is a separate audience as well. And you should have separate messaging for them, because the value proposition to your channel partners is different than your buyers, so forth, right? So you want to think about all of your audiences. And for that, you want to have things like your value proposition, your elevator pitch, your messaging pillars, and so forth. And then the product, which is the most foundational layer. And for product based companies, obviously, this is very important. And this is really, again, really describing your use cases, your features and benefits, and so on. I'll show you examples of these, so I won't go into too much detail here. But that's kind of how we approached it at Unbabel. So once you have your framework defined, the next step is often the step actually that takes the most time, but it is important for you to take time with it because it's the most critical part of this whole journey. And then that's the research part. And there's so many different kinds of research that you can do at the beginning. But really the goal of this step is to gather as much information as possible so that when you go into the process of writing, you have all of that information. Couple of things that we've done. These are by no means an exhaustive list, but it's a good start, right? You want to first, it depends on what stage of the company you're in. If you're coming into a company that has been around for a while and already has messaging, you want to audit all of your older content, strategy docs, old investor pitches, what have you, right? All of that will give you fodder for what has been said before. The next thing you want to do is interview internal stakeholders, obviously all of your leadership team, because all of them are talking to different audiences and have different perspectives. So it's really important to understand why the company was created, what the vision was, what is in their mind, where we will be 5 years from now, how they describe your product or company, right? And so forth. And key stakeholders that are maybe talking to customers every day. I mean, sales is different, but there might be other people that have really great perspectives. So you want to interview all of them. And that's more of the qualitative feedback that you're going to get. Then you can also leverage things like surveys to your advantage to just survey the entire company on questions like, how would you describe Unbabel to your grandmother? Something like that, that gives you insights into how people think about the company today and how do they talk about it. Um, if you are using any tools like Gong, which is a great sales tool that allows you to record sales conversations, listen to that or sit in on sales conversations, whatever you have time for. But it's really important to do that because then you actually get to hear the interaction between people from your organization and customers that are ultimately going to buy your product, and listen to the questions they asked or how they react to things, because that is really important information. Obviously, you want to do your competitive research and understand not just the features and functionality, sort of a matrix of how you compare. That should be done in a separate way, and obviously you're already doing that, but more from a messaging perspective of how they position themselves. One of the things people often don't leverage enough is also analysts. And if you have access to analysts like Gartner's, IDC, Forrester, whatever is relevant in your industry, they're a great resource of information, and they're talking to not just your potential customers, but they talk to vendors all day, so your competitors as well. So they have a very good view of the whole industry. So it's really important to do discovery with them. I've always found that useful. And then do market research to really understand your buyers. And that's one of the things that we did at Unbabel. Is before we started this whole process, I ran a survey, and because I come from SurveyMonkey, I tend to just gravitate to that, but there are many panels out there. But I love using their panel, which is called Audience. And it has a B2B panel, which is, we have a B2B audience. So that's what we tapped into. So what we surveyed was customer service leaders in 3 regions, US, UK, and Germany, because those are our top markets. And some of the criteria we use, and this is just to give you thoughts, but obviously this will look different for everyone. But for us, it was important to target people who have decision-making authority, have a global customer base. We collected at 600 responses. To be statistically significant, I think for surveys like this, up to 400 is fine. But we wanted to do more because we also use this for marketing purposes. And then we had about 26 questions. And just to give you an idea of the kinds of things, I mean, this is really market research. You can ask whatever makes sense for you.
How long
But
did it take to get the
field,
600
yeah.
600 answers, responses?
So the survey took about a week and a half to field, which is actually
Okay.
on the longer side. I've done surveys like this that have come back in a matter of days. It depends on your audience. Customer service is a very difficult audience to survey. But if you were surveying marketers, you probably would get 600 in a day or two.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And so some of the questions that we asked that would help us sort of build our messaging was, one, understanding their challenges, right? What is the biggest challenge they have today? We also created a bunch of statements about our solution, or potentially the statements that we would use in our messaging to kind of understand what appealed to them the most. We also had a list of things or attributes about our product, to really ask them, what do they care about in that long list of things? What are their top priorities? Because then it helps you prioritize. You only have less than 30 seconds or a minute to get your message across. So you really can't, shove a whole feature list down somebody's throat, right? Like, you have to prioritize what you talk about. So it's important to get that perspective from them. And then, we also wanted to ask how they evaluate vendors and so on. So this is just a sample of questions, but there's so many things you can ask. So we got all of that data and had some really interesting insights. What's important about market research is, obviously it will give you the data and the information you need to build your messaging, but you can repurpose this because it is not cheap. So you can repurpose this for other things as well. One, to help your internal teams get a better understanding of your buyer, which is always great, but also for marketing purposes. So we actually created a whole campaign based on the data that we collected, and got more runway out of it. So, like, I would say, when you do research, don't just use it for one thing, try to make the most of it.
Try to get budget from everyone, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Budget is critical. So make the most of it.
Cool.
Okay. So now that we've sort of done our research, collected all of that data, the next step is really sitting down and writing, right? And drafting your key messages. So getting very tactical, I mean, there's probably a whole list of things you can write down. These are the top 5 that I always focus on. You also don't need to make this super complicated, right? Like you want this to be more of a framework and a reference point. It's important to also distinguish between messaging and content. A lot of times people think you create a messaging framework and that's your marketing content. And that is very dangerous because it's not, right? This is going to be the framework that your marketing team uses to create content. So it's more of a guidance and a guided book of how to talk about different things. So what few of the things that I always like to create is your unique value proposition, an elevator pitch, which is a little bit more conversational, a list of your core differentiators, so what's unique about you, key messaging pillars. So what are the top 3 to 5 things that you want to highlight? Like if you were on a homepage, what are the 5 sections you want to have? That's a good way to think about it. And features and benefits when you're thinking about product, for instance. The list of things will vary, like I mentioned earlier, based on whether it's a brand level, whether it's your audience level, or whether it's your product level, because features and benefits should live in your product level, not your brand level, right? So there's things to think about there. If you Google a template for the unique value proposition, you'll see multiple templates out there. Use whatever makes sense to you. At the end of the day, there's few key things that all of these templates will have. One, talking about your segment. Who is your audience? And for the purposes of this workshop, I'm only going to focus the rest of the time on our audience layer of messaging because that's the one where people struggle the most. But also it is one of the critical ones, right? Because that's going to affect your sales. So who is your audience? What is the customer segment that you're selling to? What is the challenge that they're facing? What is your solution? So how in a line or 2 would you describe your offering? How is that solving their problem? And you can do this again in many different ways. It's a solution benefit statement. I like to frame it as we help you do X so you can do X. Once you come up with that framework, that it just makes more sense to do all of your messaging in a certain way so that it starts to make it easier and consistent. And then what makes you unique? So these, I don't like to have more than 5 core differentiators. 3 is ideal. People actually consume information in 3s really well. So if you can swing that, it's ideal. But you don't want to also have a list of 20 core differentiators. That will never be useful. And so at this point, when you've drafted all of those things that we just talked about, and there's no need for anybody to kind of read through all of this. The purpose for me to sort of highlight this is that you want to have 2 versions of your elevator pitch, which is what we did. We had a version 1 and version 2. They both at the end of the day talk about Unbabel and are probably saying the same thing, but just using different language. And this is where you go into the next step. So have 2 or maximum 3 versions. 2 is ideal because it makes it easier to test. And that's really the next phase, which is testing and refining. So testing, again, the first critical part of this process is research, then it's the testing, because this will really help you nail down what resonates. So testing can be done in so many different ways. As I mentioned earlier, different channels will require different kinds of formats of messaging. So it is important to test your messaging in as many different channels as possible, whatever you can swing. But a couple of ideas are, again, using market research to test again. And that's the example that I'll show you that we did. You can also do qualitative interviews. And it is actually important to have both qualitative and quantitative data. You can also use things like SEM ads because that's a quick and cheap way to just do a control test, A/B test. You can create landing pages on your website and test messaging there and use to measure things like engagement or traffic or clicks, whatever you're trying to achieve, what the goal is of that page. You can test things in email if you have nurture campaigns already. Maybe you can test subject lines or a section on your emails. Social media, you can run tests there. You can even, if you have a kind of a product that has a lot of in messaging ads or in product messaging, again, great way to test your messaging. And then if you have a sales-led product, definitely leverage your sales team. Have a pilot team that runs your messaging through with some prospects or uses it in their outreach messages, for instance.
If you can't do all of them, which one do you choose?
So we definitely chose the market research from a quantitative perspective. We did qualitative interviews. We did a little bit of the website and a little bit of the sales outreach.
Okay.
If those are the four that we chose, the other ones are nice to have. If you had just had the option to do two, I would do the first two.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I'll talk about those two actually. So we did both qual and quant. For qualitative, we leveraged two sites that I've seen work to find the right audience. It was Respondent.io and user interviews. Plus, we tapped into our own network. So I have an intern on my team, and he just went on LinkedIn and sourced through his network CS leaders that he was connected to or found. And so doing all of that, we came up with 10 people that were that fit our criteria, and we used incentives. So it really does help to use incentives when you're doing research like this, because people's time is valuable. And so we offered $100 gift cards in exchange for an hour of interviews, and we were able to do 10 customer interviews. And the second thing we did was a concept test. There are templates out there for a concept test, but it basically is an A/B test that you can use for anything from image testing if you're running a campaign or messaging. And so we targeted 400 respondents that fit our ICP that I talked about earlier. And so the thing that we really were testing, you saw those versions of our elevator pitch, A and B. We showed people both those versions and then asked them questions about what their first impression was, how simple was the message, how unique it was, how relevant it was to their function, how believable it was. Did it help them get interested in learning more about the product? And then we kind of showed them the two together and asked them for their overall preference between one or two. So that's what we did with both our qualitative interviews and our quantitative interviews. The list of attributes that I walked through, like in terms of what we asked, is a small list of probably 20 other things that you can ask. But these are some that made sense to us because we wanted our message to be unique and relevant and simple, for instance. So it was important for us to test for that, like which messaging is simpler, unique, and more relevant to understand, for instance. But you can ask whatever you want. And so based on this test, we really found that our second version of our pitch resonated the most, which is what we went forward with. But there were elements of the first pitch that people really liked, especially in the qualitative interviews. People pointed out certain things. They were like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So what we ended up doing is using the framework of our second pitch, but used elements that people liked in the first one and incorporate them into the second one. And so again, I won't read through all of this, but my goal was just to kind of give you an idea of what you can end up with. So this is our 100-word elevator pitch. And when I write elevator pitches, one, I like to write them in different word counts because you want to have a single liner. You want to have 25 words, 50 words, and then 100 words. The 100 words is what you're seeing here. And that's like the longer version where you're telling a story and you have time to give somebody a pitch. But then the smaller versions are if like you can use it for different purposes when it's written or spoken. One of the things that I also will mention is something that I've learned over time is that the way people write sometimes is different than the way people speak. And with elevator pitches, it's actually really important to be able to speak it. And not a lot of times people actually test their messaging by speaking out loud. And when you do that, you sometimes realize that you've written this beautiful story, but then when you start to say it, you're like, wait, this sounds very odd to say. And you are going to give this to your sales team, and they're going to have to get on the phone and say this. And if it doesn't sound natural, you need to adjust it. So
I think
I
there is
found that a very interesting thing to do is sit down and actually read it out loud first.
I think there is a French writer, I'll probably write down in the comments. And this writer had a room called the shouting room, something like that. And he used to yell his text. And when you yell like really out loud the text, you realize how painful some words can be. And this was his way of trimming and and deleting words was by shouting as loud as he could uh, everything that he had written.
That is very interesting. I want to know who this is, but
I'll send you.
yeah, I don't recommend shouting in an office if you're working in person in an office, but certainly speak it out loud. I think it's a very interesting exercise to go through.
Yeah, love that.
All right. And then the fifth step in the process is really going back to the credibility piece that I mentioned earlier on. Once you have your messaging, you obviously have certain pillars or core differentiators that you've come up with, right? Like our product is easy to use, is an example, or our product produces the highest quality translations. Those are some example claims that you're potentially making. How do you back them up? So at this point, you really want to gather your proof points. And these can be things that you might already have, right? There's three things that I like to use in a variety of ways. You also don't want to just have one thing, right? So you can use your company stats or product stats, right? If there's certain stats that really help illustrate a concept, use that. Like usage on your platform or things like that, scale on your platform. You can also survey your current customers to gather some data and aggregate it versus doing customer stories, which are obviously individual and more in-depth and show ROI, but they're harder to get. It's always hard to get approval and you're limited in the customer stories you can do. So I love to run surveys and get data in aggregate and kind of be able to state certain numbers, which is what I'll show you what we did. And then obviously I'm sure you're doing customer studies and stories, use that, pull quotes out of it to support certain claims. So for example, we did a survey. We sent an email to all of our current customers. It was a 10-question survey. You don't want to overwhelm them either. We had about 50 respondents and we offered an incentive where we raffled off a $200 Amazon gift card. So incentives always help you get more responses. And so I have an example of three sort of stats that we were able to produce as a result of that survey. So one of the things we talk about is that, we deliver high quality translations. And so we were able to get this great number that 80% of our customers agree that Unbabel delivers authentic, high quality translations. Secondly, same thing, we talk about how easy it is to get started with Unbabel. So we were able to get this data point around, 78% of our customers agree. And then one of the benefits that we always talk about for Unbabel is that we reduce costs. And so we were able to say that over half of our customers see operational costs reduced by up to 30% after implementing Unbabel. So this is, again, just an example of the kinds of data you can get just by doing a quick survey. It's a cheap, easy, effective way of getting data points when you don't have enough customer stories to leverage.
How did you choose the people to send the survey to?
So you work very closely with your customer success team if you have one. They're the ones that know the customers and they will know who your champion is at the company or
Okay.
who is the person that they're interfacing with, who has the right data.
Yes.
Or the alternative is just send it to all the contacts you have within an organization and the right people will take the
Yeah,
survey.
because it can be a little biased if you're sending this survey to customers with a high NPS, for example, versus like choosing
Exactly.
randomly within the customer base.
Yeah, we sent it to all our customers. So
Okay.
I didn't really cherry pick the customers itself, but the context within the companies, we selected people based on like who would actually have the data to be able to tell us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Fun fact: at the previous company I was working with, we realized that some countries are more severe, like culture from a cultural point of view. Like for example, French people very seldomly give an NPS of 10 out of 10. Like it's always 9.
High
Always
standard.
something to improve.
That's
So it
true.
was
And
hard to take that into account.
I can totally see that. Yeah, I'm sure there's biases when it comes to different regions for sure. It's also interesting because the how open people are to giving feedback also changes based on cultures. Like in certain cultures, it's actually harder for them to be very honest and give feedback to people versus some others that are very
Yeah.
like open about feedback. The sixth step in this process is now that you have everything, rolling it out, which might seem simple, but actually can take time and can be complicated if you don't plan it out. I like to break it out in two processes, right? There's the internal activation, like I mentioned. It's so important to arm your internal team before you start rolling this out externally. And for an internal activation, couple of things that you want to do, and obviously there's probably a million ways to do this, but a couple of things you want to make sure you do is, one, create a single source of truth, whether it's your intranet, whatever tool you use, a central place somewhere where everyone has access to. Put your messaging there so everyone can sort of self-serve it. You also want to create assets that people can use. Messaging framework is great for marketing, but sales can't use it as it is, right? It's just a framework. So you want to use that messaging and then create actionable assets like one pagers or sales decks or whatever you need in your company that people can actually leverage, right? And then you want to make sure that throughout this process, you're sharing the data and the insights with the right people throughout the process, not just waiting at the end to kind of share these insights. So, for example, when we did that market research initially in the research phase, we set up a whole hour-long session with all of our customer-facing teams and product design to go through the learnings. It makes people feel like they're understanding the process better. It makes them feel like they're part of it. And when you actually roll it out, people will adopt it more because they will know where it's coming from, rather than marketing team just went into their bubble, came back a month later, and here's new messaging, right? That's not really going to jive with people, versus if you kind of bring them along the journey. And then you want to do trainings, whether it's live or recorded, or if you have learning management systems where you create certification. Really depends on how sophisticated your company is in your L&D department, but you want to set up trainings with the company on walking them through the messaging. And for that, you want to make it fun, make it an event, give things away, but also do this over time. One session is not going to solve this. People need to see it repeated in different ways and different formats to really absorb it. So it does take time. You have to expect that it will take time, and you have to give people that time to start absorbing this information. At the same time, when it comes to an external rollout, you want to involve different channel leaders within the marketing team. So comms will have a role to play in terms of how we talk about it in PR or thought leadership. The brand team obviously should be your close partner because a lot of this is about the brand. Your demand gen team, for instance, needs to know this because then they can make sure that their campaigns are using the same messaging and so on. So give them ownership as well of how to use this messaging in their own channels. And then over time, audit and update your marketing channels. You don't have to do it all at once, but prioritize the changes based on things that are important to you, whether it's, our website is a priority, so let's do that. It really depends on what's important to your company at that moment. And then the last step in this process is really, measuring impact. Messaging is one of those things that can be very fluffy, right? It's not really like a demand gen campaign where you're measuring the number of MQLs that you generate, for instance. But there are a couple of things you can do to measure impact. One thing that I do is, and this is outside of messaging, in general, we do quarterly surveys with our sales team to measure their confidence in a bunch of things. Confidence in talking about pricing, confidence in selling the value of our product, confidence in understanding competitors, and so on. So because I've been doing that survey over time, you can do that before and after you roll out messaging and training to them and see if it's improving sales confidence. Because at the end of the day, the value of your messaging should be that it's easier for them to pitch your product. And if they feel confident and comfortable, it's going to come across to the customers as well. If brand is a big sort of part of your strategy and focus, then you can also do brand tracking surveys and measure your brand perception in the market before and after when you roll it out over time. So those two things definitely need to be a trending thing. You can measure specific campaign performance. You can have campaigns that you've run in the old messaging and then in the new messaging and see if that improves performance. And then go back to your analysts. So, in the beginning of the process, you kind of refer to them and ask them of what works, what doesn't work, what's out there. Take your new messaging back to them and have them review it. Like Gartner, for instance, who we work with, have this whole process of doing document reviews where you can share documents with them, they review it and give you feedback. And we did that with our messaging, and it was very, very useful. So that's another way of measuring it.
I love the first one because the impact that sales confidence can have on the numbers I talk to a lot of sales leaders, and sometimes they ask like, how can we increase average ACV from 20K to 50K or 100K? And a
Yeah.
lot of that actually is done through sales confidence, of
Yes,
just the sales being confident enough to deliver the right message and deliver the right value. And the product is the same, it's just that the pitch and the value and the messaging especially is different. And this is
mhm,
what gets you from 20,000 dollar deals to $100,000 deals or $200,000 deals.
exactly. And a lot of companies actually don't measure sales confidence, which I think is such a useful metric to have.
Yeah,
So, and it's easy to measure. Like you literally just need to run a survey every quarter, every month,
I
whatever
love
works.
that. Yeah, cool.
So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Key takeaways. If I was to wrap all of this up, if there's three things that I would want people to take away, one, effective messaging is relevant, authentic, and credible. So be conscious of those three things. The second one, really important, infuse the voice of your customer into every part of the process, not just doing one survey or talking to a few customers and calling it a day, but make sure you're doing it throughout. And really using a data-driven approach to get internal consensus and alignment. A big part that we didn't go into too much detail on is part of this process is also getting alignment within the company and especially your leadership team. And there can often be multiple opinions between your leadership team in terms of what works, what doesn't. People can easily get hung up on specific words. So if you've done the right research and you have the data to back up your decisions, it makes your life so much easier to get that internal consensus and alignment. So those are my three key takeaways, and that's the workshop.
I love that. Thank you so much. I love the way that you are so organized and you have frameworks for everything and you have like clear mappings. I'm a big fan of principles and frameworks.
Me
And I
too.
love that. And I think it's actually like great leaders, they bring clarity and energy to their team. And you definitely brought a lot of clarity when it comes to
Thank you.
messaging and marketing. So thank you so much. Yeah, we can finish with the famous 5 questions. Um, Let me pull them out. So, a current book, your favorite or current book you're reading, not necessarily business book.
Yeah, I actually often do read business books, but to be honest, because I work a lot, I like to escape when I read. So I read a lot of fiction, and
Yes, me too.
I love finding books through Reese's book club. Reese Witherspoon has a book club, and I almost always love all the books that she has on it. So I am currently reading this book called The Scent Keeper. I couldn't remember the name of the author, but that's the book, The Scent Keeper.
Cool. An executive, someone one should follow or study.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great executives that are out there, but honestly, the person that I would name is Adam Grant. He's actually an organizational psychologist. He's a professor at Wharton. He's written a lot of books. He does podcasts. I've actually had the pleasure of meeting him twice and learning from him, and I just love everything he has to say. So follow him on LinkedIn. He's amazing.
Sorry, I was on mute. Cool. I didn't know him, but definitely check him out.
Yeah.
Favorite Twitter, Reddit, Instagram accounts, or what do you do to relax?
Yeah, I actually don't use Twitter or Reddit. I mean, I have accounts there, but I probably have never logged in a million years. I just find it overwhelming. And that's strange for a marketer to say. But I do love Instagram. And what I do to relax is use Instagram, but more for memes. So I am a big fan of humor. And when I've
Yeah.
had a stressful day or at the end of every night, I just kind of scroll through my feed of like funny memes and cat videos. And that's what makes me relax.
I'm a big, I have a collection of funny GIFs and I have like
Yeah, I love that.
gigabytes of GIFs that I put on Slack and
Seriously.
I'm known in my team for that. Um, Favorite online tool?
Right now, Miro. I am obsessed with Miro. I think it has changed my life, especially being remote and being able to collaborate. Obsessed with Miro.
Okay,
So,
you're the second one to point out Miro, and I love their tool as well.
yeah.
And who should I interview next?
Hmm. That is a tough question. Hmm. Well, I mean, I guess it would depend on the kinds of topics that are really interesting to your audience. Honestly, it's hard to say, but
You
I
can
mean, I think
use
there's a lot of really great companies in the Notion portfolio that I've seen present, and I'm forgetting the names, but I think I've heard some really great speakers, and that's how we met.
yeah.
So I'd say there's a lot of people. I think there was a company that presented about how they redid their brand, and I found that really interesting. I can go back and look for the name. I don't remember, but I think that would be an interesting one for your
Yeah,
audience as well, of like just
definitely.
a brand refresh.
Cool. Thank you. So, Unbabel, Series C company built in 2013, 200 people based in Lisbon and SF on a mission to break language barriers. Today, we were talking about messaging, a few takeaways and key learnings. Do that early, do it well. Positioning is not like messaging. You should have a positioning first and then messaging. Step outside the echo chamber, make space for outside perspective. Not everybody has your knowledge and about the product and industry. The framework to define effective messaging is relevancy, authenticity, credibility. Basically, you should sound more human. And then you shared a process using a real life example at Unbabel. Set up your goals. And then the 7-step process, define the framework, do your own research, draft key messages, test and refine in as many channels as possible with 2 or 3 like main channels that everyone should do. Gather proof points, do the rollout, internal and external, make it fun, repeat, and measure the impact and especially sales confidence.
You got it. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was
Thank
really
you.
like, oh, it's the second time actually you tell me that, and every time I knew I learn new things, and every time I'm blown away. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, that was it. Thank you so much, and it was great having you today.
Great speaking to you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. We'd love to hear your feedback, so feel free to send us a message or ping us directly in the comments. And if you'd like to join our community, feel free to visit our website operations.family. Cheers!